It's been a year since the province's crackdown on short-term rentals kicked in. So has it actually made housing more affordable? That's what we want to dig into.
Exactly. Our mission here is to, well, try and analyze what's happened since these rules came into effect. We're going to focus on those claims about rents falling and, importantly, the impact this might have had on tourism.
Right. We'll look at what the government's saying, naturally, but also what some experts are actually observing on the ground.
And our source for this is a news piece from the Canadian Press. It just came out yesterday, April 24th, 2025. And it looks back at this first year of BC's short-term rental rules.
Okay, so let's maybe set the scene first. Why did these rules even come about? The article uses the example of a guy named Marv Gandel living in a Victoria condo building, the Era on Yates.
Yeah, and his description is quite vivid, isn't it? He talks about, constant streams of short-term renters, the visitor parking always jammed, elevators nonstop.
He said residents called it a ghost hotel.
A ghost hotel, exactly. It sounds like it really changed the feel of the building from a home to something more like, well, transient lodging.
And it wasn't just inconvenient, right? He mentioned actual disruptions, maintenance problems cropping up more often, even worries about theft and vandalism.
It really shows how having a lot of these short-term units concentrated in one place can affect people's quality of life.
Which is precisely what the government said it wanted to fix with these regulations. They officially started May 1st, 2024.
Right. And the core rule in most communities over 10,000 people is that short-term rentals are basically limited to your principal residence, or maybe a secondary suite or a laneway house on that property.
So no more entire condos or houses being used just as full-time Airbnbs, essentially. The goal was getting those back into the long-term market.
Exactly. And there was that deadline, too, May 1st of this year, 2025, for property owners who qualified to actually register their short-term rental.
Okay, so fast forward a year. What's the government saying now?
Well, BC's housing minister, Ravi Kahlon, is pretty much declaring victory. He's pointing to what he calls dropping rents and says thousands of units have disappeared from sites like Airbnb and VRBO.
He sounds quite positive. The article mentions him saying colleagues are telling stories about former short-term places now housing long-term families.
Yeah, and he makes a big claim that rents are down across the province. That's a broad statement.
It is. We should probably look at the data on that. What about the registry numbers first? How many people actually signed up?
Okay, so by early April, the province had about 15,000 properties registered, and they collected over $3 million in fees from that.
And how does that compare to before?
Well, the estimate was around 22,000 short-term rentals operating before the registry. So if you do the math, that suggests maybe 7,000 operators could have just left the market.
7,000 units. That does sound like it could make a difference to supply. And what happens if you didn't register?
There are teeth to it. Starting May 1st, so right about now, unregistered listings are supposed to be removed. And any bookings for after June 1st, canceled.
So the enforcement mechanism seems to be there. Okay, fewer listings maybe. Does the data show fewer actual short-term rentals available?
The Ministry of Housing shared some data. Between May 2024 and February 2025, they saw pretty big drops in listings for entire properties on these sites, like 31% down in Kelowna, 24% in Victoria, and 22% in Vancouver.
Okay, those are significant percentages.
And they also mentioned vacancy rates reportedly went up a bit in those cities between 2023 and 2024.
Right, so fewer short-term listings, maybe slightly higher vacancy rates. But here's the crunch, isn't it? What about the actual rent prices? Is the minister's claim of province-wide drops holding up?
This is where it gets murky. The picture is quite mixed. Rental.ca data for March 2025 showed, a tiny average rent decrease year over year for BC as a whole, just 0.6%.
Okay, very small.
But Vancouver saw a bigger drop, 5.7%, which they noted was the 16th month in a row it had fallen.
16 months? That predates these rules then, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, the trend started before May 2024. But here's the contrast. Victoria, during that same period, rents went up by 3%.
Up. Okay, so definitely not down across the whole province then.
Yeah.
That contradicts the minister's statement somewhat.
It certainly complicates it. And then you have the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC. Their forecast from February actually predicted average rents might rise in the future.
Why is that?
Because new rental units coming onto the market tend to be priced higher. So even if vacancy rates go up a bit, maybe because population growth slows, the average rent could still climb.
So we've got falling listings, some rent drops in Vancouver, but rises in Victoria, and a forecast for potentially rising average rents overall. It's messy.
It really is. And this brings us neatly to what the experts are saying. People like Andy Yan, he's the director of the city program at Simon Fraser University.
What's his take?
His main point is that, yeah, we see some data suggesting rents or condo prices dipped, but trying to pin that specifically on the short-term rental rules, it's incredibly difficult.
Because there's so much else going on.
Exactly. Think about interest rates, the general economy, big shifts in immigration policy affecting population growth. He uses this analogy of trying to hear one specific instrument in a really noisy orchestra.
Right, the noise makes it hard to isolate one cause. So the government might be claiming a success, but experts are saying, hold on, it's not that simple.
Pretty much. And you also have to listen to tenants themselves.
Good point. What are they experiencing?
The article includes input from Will Gladman of the Vancouver Tenants Union. He says their members are, and I'm quoting here, quite reliably experiencing rent increases, despite what some stats might show.
Increases. So the opposite of the government's claim, at least for their members.
Yeah, and his broader point is crucial. Even if there are slight average decreases reported somewhere, housing costs are still sky high and fundamentally unaffordable for a lot of people.
So the tenants union, they're basically saying these rules, while maybe good in theory for converting units, weren't expected to solve the core affordability crisis anyway.
That seems to be their view. They feel the government relies too much on these kinds of market tweaks rather than maybe more direct interventions.
Okay, so skepticism from experts about causality, tenants reporting continued high costs. But there's another angle here too, right? The impact on tourism.
A big one. Brendan Ogmanson is the chief economist for the BC Real Estate Association, makes a strong argument here. He suggests these regulations might have actually done more harm than good.
Harm. How so?
By hitting the tourism sector hard.
Yeah.
He argues that any rent decreases we are seeing are probably more because of new housing supply finally coming online, and maybe because fewer international students and temporary foreign workers are arriving key renter groups.
So he thinks the short-term rental rules had minimal impact on rent.
He calls the impact on rental affordability likely pretty small. But the impact on tourism, he thinks that's much more significant. Potentially higher hotel prices, fewer choices for visitors.
That's a really important counterargument. It basically flips the government's narrative, saying the main effect wasn't helping renters much, but rather hurting tourism.
It really challenges the win-win scenario. And it makes you think about the long term. Even Marv Gandel, the resident who initially benefited,
The ghost hotel guy.
yeah, even he apparently worries the rules might get rolled back if hotel prices keep climbing too high.
And didn't the premier say something about that?
Premier David Eby mentioned possibly easing restrictions once the province gets back to what he called healthy rental levels. So the future of these rules isn't necessarily set in stone.
And are people following the rules? Is enforcement working? Gandel suspected people might be fibbing about primary residences.
That's always a concern with regulations like this. Minister Kalan insists they have a thorough verification process and that the fines like $5,000 a day are a serious deterrent.
$5,000 a day is hefty.
It is. But, enforcement in practice can be tricky. Despite all this complexity and the conflicting signals, though, the government seems determined.
They're sticking to their guns.
Absolutely. Minister Kalan sounds confident, expects other provinces might even copy BC, and points to positive feedback from local governments. They seem committed to this path.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. It sounds like the situation is, well, complicated. The government points to some positive signs, fewer short-term listings, some rent moderation in places like Vancouver.
And this is a big but. Experts are really hesitant to give the regulations all the credit for rent changes, given everything else happening in the economy. And tenant groups say affordability hasn't fundamentally improved for many.
And crucially, there's this significant counter-argument about the negative impact on tourism, which might be, according to some, the main effect of these rules.
Exactly. That core idea that restricting short-term rentals is the primary reason rents might be softening doesn't seem strongly supported when you look at all the evidence. And the potential cost to the tourism industry seems like a major factor that needs weighing.
Right. So the key takeaway feels like this. Claiming the rent drops are mostly down to this crackdown is probably an oversimplification. There are many factors, and the hit to tourism is a real concern.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. When you weigh everything, the need for housing supply, the state of the economy, the importance of tourism, What do you think is the best path forward for BC? How do you balance making housing more affordable without seriously damaging a key industry like tourism?
And maybe what other information or data would really help us understand the full picture of what these regulations have actually done over the past year? Something to think about.